Let's talk about this week. So you have today, our normal day, and then tomorrow you probably know you're off. It's the teacher in-service day. We're coming back on Wednesday, but that is a virtual Phantom Finisher day. And then Thursday and Friday, some of you lucky students out there are going to be taking your biology keystones. So that's a 2-hour delay schedule. If you're taking the bio keystones, then you can you come in person, and I think you can choose to stay or not, or choose to stay or go home. I'm not sure, but you know, the rest of the day you have shortened periods. Let me just respond to a couple things in the chat, and then I'll get back to you. Okay, sorry about that. So for today, we'll continue to work on the craft of writing. So you had your outlines for your papers. Those were due today. So if you haven't finished those and haven't uploaded them, you have this class period to wrap those up. What I want to do is talk about intro paragraphs, because now for the next couple of weeks, we're really just focusing on writing the paper. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how much easier it is to write this when you have your outline finished. When you know what you're trying to say and you're just trying to find the right words, it goes a lot smoother. So we'll start that process today. I want to talk about openers or hooks. We've addressed these before with the op-ed, but I think that time is ripe for a refresher, and I'll point out some strategies that are more unique to research papers. In terms of upcoming assignments, know that your first rough draft is due this week. It was going to be due on Wednesday. Because we have this day off tomorrow, I decided to push it back. So your first rough draft is due on Thursday. It's 2 pages, so you have 3 days to write 2 pages. If you think back to like the Dubliners quiz, a lot of you wrote 2 pages in a class period. So writing 2 pages, especially when you have it outlined in 3 days, shouldn't be a big lift. And on Wednesday, when we have this Phantom Finisher day, I'll be meeting with you guys, as many as you as possible, one-on-one, to check in on your progress and make sure we're all progressing. Okay. So that's your overview. Before we get into the lesson, any questions for me? Okay, great. So I want to start with a little bit of a psychological experiment. So I'm going to ask you a question. It's on the next slide. And I just want to hear your gut reaction, like how you would respond to this within like the first 5 seconds of hearing the question. And you could just shout it out or immediately type it in the chat, whichever you prefer, but gut reaction. So here's the question. What kind of person would you rather go on a date with? Person A, who can be described with these words, or person B, who's best described with these words? You say B? Interesting.
I'd say the first one.
Say the first one? It's interesting how people say the second one. Yeah, so people are finally starting to realize and put in the chat, wait a minute, these are the same words. Yes, they are. So there, you might notice the second one is just the same words reversed. But this first one begins with words with a more positive connotation. So there was a psychological study done with this very question. my guess is that most of you had the reaction that I had, which is you first scan these and your immediate reaction is, oh, well, person A seems better. That person's intelligent and industrious, the other person's envious and stubborn. And what this study found was evidence for something called the primacy effect. This has been repeated and found to be fairly consistent, that when you're presented with information, a series of pieces of information, the information that's presented first is more memorable and we think more positively about it. That's what our attention fixates on, the first thing. Information in the middle, we tend to like zone out and not put much weight on it, and then we pay attention again at the end. Okay. So this is true of lots of different domains, but it's interesting just to see this sort of scientific evidence that first impressions matter. And the opening line of your essay is the first impression for your reader. So I just wanted to show you this to really emphasize that the first sentence or two has, it's such a small overall percentage of your paper, but it has a disproportionate weight on what people will think about your paper overall. And I don't think this is just something that's true for academic writing in an English classroom. This is true of any kind of writing or communicating, whether you're writing a memo for work, if you're giving a presentation to clients or writing an article for a newspaper, the first sentence matters. The first sentence is your opportunity to make the reader care. So we're practicing it within the genre of academic writing, but it has wide-reaching importance. So what makes a good opener? Well, two things I think it should do. One, it needs to establish the main idea of your paper, give a sort of hint to your reader about what's to come. It also should create some sort of positive emotional reaction, just like a tinge of something, just so the reader doesn't read it and feel numb or disinterested. It might be curiosity, but it could be awe or surprise, maybe confusion even, and the reader might want to resolve the confusion by reading more, but you should try to create some kind of reaction. And at the very least, my hope is you write an opener that doesn't make me groan, that doesn't make me roll my eyes. And there are some basic strategies you could follow to do that. So first I want to go over a couple of things that you should avoid. These are really common opening lines that students will use for really any kind of academic paper. First one's called a dawn of time opener. Now, these aren't really bad in and of themselves. They're bad because of how overused they are. They're relatively easy to come up with, so students come up with them a lot, and they're just kind of cliched. And as a teacher, and this isn't just me saying this, this is, I think, widely thought to be true. You see one of these and it's like, oh, a dawn of time opening. Okay, so what is a dawn of time opening? It's just a really grandiose, broad, kind of sweeping statement about some universal truth about the world. And it's meant to sound profound, but often it just comes off as kind of obvious and whoever's writing it is trying too hard. Okay. And usually the sentences talk about something that's been true since the dawn of time, or since the dawn of civilization, or since the dawn of humanity, and so on. So here are a few that I took from student essays from last year. Ever since the beginning of civilization, humans have fought against each other for wealth, right? So you see that, and that's true, but is anyone surprised by that? Did anyone not know that humans have always fought against each other for resources? I think that's pretty common knowledge. Right? Or this next one, literary elements can be seen in all walks of literature. However, the way in which they are implemented determines their effect on the writing. So the way you write determines the effect of your writing? That's also obviously true. It doesn't need to be stated. I'm reading that, it sounds good, but there's not much to it. Okay. Last one, what is the meaning of death? Is death always meant to happen at a certain time? Why should we fear death? It was like they wanted to have some kind of provocative question, and they weren't sure if the first one worked, so they just kept throwing out more. This just seems a little over-exaggerated to me. Again, like they're trying too hard. Okay. So these should be avoided. You don't want to start out too broad. You don't want it to have an opening that could apply to any paper. On the other hand, you don't want it to be too narrow either. I like this one from last year. Opening line, The Mask of the Red Death is a short story written by Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, that is true, but it's a bit, too short, too direct to start your essay. So don't go overboard and overcorrect here. I actually like the second sentence of this as an opener. In a world ravaged by a plague known as the Red Death, a wealthy prince hosts a large party. That's not bad. If you have an opener like this with some kind of interesting writing, something that flows well, I might tweak the second half of the sentence, but I would have recommended that this student would just delete this sentence and then start here. And that would be a fine opener. So watch out for dawn of time openings. I would also watch out for questions that have easy answers. So students like starting essays with questions, and questions are a good go-to strategy. You just have to be careful. The question needs to be an interesting question. It can't just have one simple answer. You also want to make sure that the answer that the reader gives isn't just going to be no. Okay. So for example, let's say someone's writing about the yellow wallpaper, and this is what they choose to start with. Have you ever found yourself sick and being taken care of by someone who thought they knew how to make you feel better, but the solutions they gave you only made things worse? I read that and my initial thought is, no, that's never happened to me. And like already, I feel like I can't relate to the paper. The first thought I have after reading this is a negative. Like that's just starting off on the wrong foot. This is a very specific question. It's not going to apply to everyone. I mean, maybe it does apply to you, but it doesn't to me. So if you have a question, you want to make sure that it's not going to alienate your reader by being too narrow. Okay. Same thing with the second one. Do you believe in supernatural beings? Maybe some of you guys do, but I don't. And so I read this and I'm like, no. And like, that's it. So my curiosity is not piqued. I'm just already on the defensive after the first sentence. So avoid yes or no questions in your opener. Make sure whatever question you're asking is kind of interesting, is going to grab someone's attention. So that's a lot of what not to do. Let me show you a few examples of what to do, and then I'll let you get to writing. Oh, had a question in the chat. Can we have an opener that mentions the author? Yeah, absolutely. It's totally fine to mention the title and the author in the opening. There are times when that could be appropriate. Okay, so here's one from, this is an actual opening from an essay submitted last year. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, treatment for mental illness was inadequate and nearly non-existent. Women in particular were ostracized from society and controlled by inhumane orders that doctors believed would cure their hysteria. This isn't flashy or dramatic, but it works. It tells us exactly what we're talking about. This is a paper about the yellow wallpaper and psychological treatments at the time. I think it's kind of well written. It flows fine. This is fine. You don't have to knock the reader's socks off. You just have to get them acquainted, establish your idea and make them want to keep reading. So this is workable for an intro. Okay. Here's another example. You can start with a quote. This is what this person did for a story, an essay about young Goodman Brown. The woman saw that the tree's fruit was good to eat and pleasing to look at. She also saw that it would make a person wise. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. According to the Bible, from the very beginning of time, humans were tempted by the devil to do evil or to sin. Young Goodman Brown's all about biblical allusion, so it kind of makes sense to start with a quote from the Bible. I like this. I think it, again, it works, establishes the main idea, kind of pulls me in. It's a nicely phrased quote, so this is fine. You could use a quote. I would recommend, if you're going to use a quote, I would use a quote that's either from the story that you're writing about or a quote by someone else writing about your author, or maybe something that your author like wrote in a journal or in an interview or something like that. You know, I would keep it directly related to the author, but in this case, I think this is fine. Also note that usually I always say quotes need to be embedded, right? They need to be inside another sentence. Note that this is not embedded. That's okay. So an opener quote is the one exception to that rule where it can just stand on its own, and then you can explain the quote immediately after, and that works. Okay, last one. So here's an example of a question that I think works. What exactly is isolation? So if they just stopped there, I would say that's probably not sufficient. That's kind of too broad. But it goes on, what exactly is isolation? Is it separation from human contact, from entertainment, or from pleasure? Perhaps the worst type of isolation of all is the dissociation from your passion. So I kind of like that idea. It starts off with, you know, isolation, but then it adds some layers to it by saying, you know, it's true isolation from other people or from emotional experiences, from entertainment. So that kind of gets me thinking like, well, you know, can you be isolated from other people but not feel lonely? You know, so to me, this works. It's a question. It's kind of interesting. There isn't a yes or no answer. All right. Well, those are a bunch of different examples for you to look at. Again, my hope with this, with your opener, is just that you avoid those pitfalls of yes or no questions or dawn of time openings. Just strive to get an emotional reaction, introduce your main idea, but just pay attention to the opener. It's your first impression and you want to make it good. All right, any questions about open?